Hey everybody, this is Rick Eckstein from Villanova University. I was looking forward to going to my first CSRI conference last year about this time, and that didn't happen. I was looking forward to my second one this year, and that's not going to happen. So we'll make the best we can out of the lemonades or the lemons that we have been dealt. I wanted to talk today a little bit about understanding college athlete emotional health and suicide, and share with you the efforts I've been making to try to develop a more structural or sociological model for looking at this very important topic. Thought I'd let you know how I got into it in the first place. A couple of years ago, I met with an athletic director at a small liberal arts college who was very, very interested in addressing issues of athlete stress and athlete anxiety. And we were talking about it, and I made some suggestions about maybe doing some workshops that looked at things other than just how people would cope or adopt or adapt to certain situations that were causing stress, and instead try to focus on some of the more systemic causes of that stress in the first place. And he was intrigued, and we started working on some things. And then of course the pandemic hit, and that was that in terms of doing some really in-depth work with coaches and with athletes. Around that same time, a friend of mine at Villanova who has done some documentary work, especially social justice documentaries, he approached me with an idea of doing a documentary on athlete mental health and athlete suicide. And so we started working on that with a third person who had been a varsity athlete about 40 years ago when things were much different. And then the pandemic hit, so we had to put that on hold. But I've been working in during that time on trying to develop this model, and I was hoping, to present it live and get some immediate feedback. But I certainly hope some of you will weigh in and get back to me after you watch this, if you watch this, and let me know what you think and have any suggestions. So I'm really approaching this with the idea that the way that we normally look at athlete mental health and athlete suicide more particularly is it's facing some problems. It's an uphill battle. There's not a lot of research that's been done. Not a lot of the research that's been done is really connected to itself. It's sort of atomized. It doesn't fit into any sort of models or patterns. It's just kind of out there. A lot of it has some problematic methodology. Now, I'm not exactly a sophisticated quantitative analyst, but there are problems with some of the surveys that have been done, with some of the operationalization of certain factors, and I think that needs to be addressed a little bit. But what I'm more interested in is developing an actual model. Is the theoretical part, is trying to move away from our tendency to psychologize these kinds of issues, to talk about athlete and non-athlete mental health and stress of college students more generally, also in focusing on things like time management, how they can come up with some coping strategies. Issues of sleep deprivation have been kind of pervasive in the literature a little more recently. Taking mental health days somehow with the emphasis on the individual, somehow making changes to what they do and how they approach the world around them in order to feel less stress and less anxiety, rather than addressing those systemic and structural sources of anxiety in the first place. It's as though we just sort of take them for granted, and don't offer a critical analysis of those structural sources of stress. It's up to us and up to students and up to athletes to figure out how to deal with those things, not to challenge the existence of those things in the first place. I also want to make sure that we address this kind of bias that we have in a lot of sports research, is that we tend to focus on Division I sports, and within them we tend to focus on the revenue generating sports. And granted, those are very interesting, and there is the whole revenue angle, which can keep us busy for a long time. But my my hypothesis, I suppose, is that the things that we normally associate with Division I sports and revenue generating sports, things like extra stress, things like extra anxiety because of those economic pressures, those commercial pressures that are placed on those particular teams and those particular athletes. There's actually been a kind of convergence of stress inducing phenomena outside of the teams, even, but even within the teams, that affects people in non-revenue Division I sports and also in Division III sports. There'll be a little bit of data later that shows how there may be more similarities than differences between Division III and Division I. And that kind of flies in the face of some of the rhetoric, the popular rhetoric that we normally subscribe to, that somehow Division III sports is immune from a lot of the pressures of Division I sports, and that non-revenue sports in general might be immune from the pressures that are felt by revenue generating athletes in football and men's basketball primarily. Now, in terms of a practical application, I think if we approach things psychologically only, then we're going to have mitigation strategies that focus on the individual. But if we raise our game a little bit, if we start looking at more structural and systemic elements, then we've got to start asking tougher questions about the way that higher education itself is organized, the way that intercollegiate athletics itself is organized, perhaps the way that families also interact with the whole higher education process needs to be questioned and critiqued. So it's a whole different set of strategies that we would use to intervene and try to help individuals if we approach this structurally and systemically rather than strictly psychologically. Now here's some just a little bit of data to show what's been going on. And again, this is a little bit old. It's the best I could find because these things are not being studied as much probably as they should be. And I skipped over my little IRB diatribe on the first slide because I knew I would get all worked up and probably just throw the headset down and storm off to have a whiskey or something. But there have been obstacles to scholars doing research on sensitive topics, and I'd say that mental health and suicide, more particularly, are pretty sensitive. And I've talked to colleagues, and they've been dissuaded from pursuing certain strategies because it's seen as being overly sensitive and possibly harmful to the subjects, the human subjects that would be either interviewed or surveyed. I'm hoping to avoid that. I'm in the midst of the IRB process as we speak, so we'll hope that goes well. So you can see that there are differences, and we've kind of known this, that there are differences between people of say young adults and their tendency to commit suicide and even have suicide ideations. It's greater than among college students and greater than among athletes. So athletes, has always been assumed that athletes have this kind of, or being part of a team or being part of an organized sport has this kind of protective effect, that athletes are less likely to have suicidal tendencies or to actually commit suicide. Female athletes, the least likely to do it. So there's a sort of a gender protective effect as well as an athlete protective effect. And except for football is when maybe the one outlier where the suicide rates are significantly higher than in other sports. But this difference is notable, but it also seems to be shrinking. And again, the data are tough sometimes to reconcile, but this protective effect or alleged protective effect of athletics, it seems to be shrinking. A little more clearly that let's say the advantage of being female in terms of suicide rates also seems to be shrinking. So that gender gap between male suicide rates and female suicide rates seems to be shrinking. And also among athletes, that protective effect seems to be shrinking, or that gap of protection seems to be shrinking between men and women. Now, I want to be a little wary here. The whole problem with assigning some kind of causal effect to sports in protecting people from suicidal tendencies or actually committing suicide. And we run into a problem with this, just like in some of the common studies that assert that sports imparts upon its participants certain skills that are really important, leadership skills. There's been a lot of research showing that athletes and non-athletes differ on certain metrics when it comes to leadership, but those studies are terribly flawed, as been pointed out by Jay Coakley and others through the years, is that we we're kind of conflating correlation and causation. There may be people who come to sports with certain qualities already. It's not that sports adds value to them or adds skills to them because they've already had them. Right? So we talk about the self-selection or the filtering process, whereby gatekeepers would select certain people with certain qualities to, let's say, be on a team or to be captains of a team. Right? So we got to be careful not to say that it's sports itself that necessarily gives this protective effect in terms of suicide or thinking of suicide or mental health, because people may be drawn to sports who are already disinclined to behave in that particular way, right? So we got to be careful with that. Same with the shrinking gender gap, and with the gap, the shrinking gap between athletes and non-athletes, who my daughter and others, I think, very fondly refer to as NARPs, non-athletic regular people, which I think is a compliment as a regular person. Why those gaps are shrinking may be related to sports. They may not be related to sports. And it could be the whole process and the whole dynamic of higher education right now, above and beyond sports team membership or organized sports team membership, that's making the difference and impacting levels of stress, anxiety, and possibly suicide. So there has been there's been a little bit of research done. The American College Health Association, they do a survey every couple of years, and they've been doing it, and they did it both pre-pandemic and post, and during the pandemic. It's not post-pandemic yet, just wishful thinking. There are also some methodological problems in here. I don't want to get into them too much, but it's really the methodology and approach seems to be greatly influenced by a psychological model. And in fact, one of the things as I was going through the tables and the data is that they've come up with 14 or 15 different ways to ask people if they're stressed. It's stress, it's anxiety, it's loneliness, it's sadness, and a bunch of others. And there are other things that we could ask college students about besides their stress, to see what it is that kind of leads them to feel the way they do and act the way that they do. And what I noticed in looking at the surveys more recently during the pandemic, and in some of the data from before the pandemic, is there hasn't really been a lot of change. I think there may be a little too much emphasis being placed right now on the pandemic, somehow having revolutionary changes on the way that people act. And no doubt it's affecting it. But you see that there's all this kind of contradictory information if you look here at the results, right? Slight increases in depression, but slight decreases in suicide ideation, slight increases in loneliness, no change in anxiety. So I'm not sure that the students who are answering this are really necessarily clear on the distinction between depression or loneliness or sadness or anxiety. And I'm not sure I am. I don't think they're really clinical terms. They're more just sort of subjective approaches that people take. Now, more interestingly, the NCAA has done a couple of surveys, both in the last spring when the pandemic first hit, and also this coming fall. So they only recently shared some of the data. And NCAA, and some of you may have worked with them or tried to work with them, they're very, very proprietary with their data. They don't like to share it with people. And when they do, they like to share the old data with people. So stuff from 2004 and 2006, they're sitting on a treasure trove. And for some reason, they do not want independent scholars to be looking at this. I could go into conjecture about why, but I'm going to choose not to do that right now. So these NCAA surveys, they were problematic. There were a lot of good information in them, but they had poor response rates, and they were oversampled and undersampled, and they tried to use the ACHA data as a kind of longitudinal substitute, and it didn't work very well, because I think there may have been some leaking of samples. The ACHA data set includes athletes, so in a sense they're being counted twice in any kind of comparison. More importantly, though, again, this is this theoretical limitation that looking only at psychological factors like stress, and not really looking into how other things beyond whether someone is sad or anxious is affecting them, and what the sources are. And in terms of measuring that, what all these studies usually lack is an emphasis on making this into some kind of ordinal for people to choose which of these factors is most important. Because if you just give them a laundry list of factors, do these things make you sad? Yes, 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 yes. But if you ask them to order them and ask them to prioritize, then you start seeing some interesting patterns that allow you to kind of zero in. And for me, that would mean zeroing in more qualitative ways through interviews to see what it is that's playing out instead of just dealing with this kind of laundry list of things that's affecting them. So here's just some of the things that the NCAA found. And again, I'm very interested in both gender, and I'm very interested in this distinction between Division One and Division Three. Or what you can see if you look over these numbers quickly, there's really not much of a difference between Division One and Division Three. You might suspect, given kind of conventional wisdom, that the stress levels and the anxiety levels might be higher in Division One, where there's more at stake, where sometimes there's scholarship money at stake, where the pressure you would assume is greater, where the school puts more emphasis on it. But what you see, and what I would argue, is that there's been this convergence between the sort of ideology of Division Three sports and the ideology of Division One sports. Division Three sports is really no longer a place where people are playing sports for the love of it, for the fun of it, where there's clear seasons and you can do multiple sports, and in the time that you're not in season, you can do other things at school besides focusing on your sport. But that's becoming less and less common. Division Three is starting to look more and more like Division One structurally. And if we to take this data at face value, it's starting to look similarly in how it's impacting the students. Now, there you see with both Division One and Division Three, you've got almost the very same gender splits in terms of how male male athletes and female athletes are kind of internalizing these issues and how it's affecting them personally. Now, it could be that they're reporting them differently, but that's really what we have to go on. All right, so in terms of building a more structural model, right, I'm trying here to go beyond the psychological, beyond the individualistic, right, beyond telling people they need to find ways and help them with coping, maybe providing more counseling, which is a terrific thing. We should not provide more counseling, but we shouldn't think that it's the only thing that's going to help people in how they're feeling and whether they have suicidal tendencies or actually engage in suicide. So this, I think it's important also that we have some kind of control, that we look at non-athletes as well as athletes to see if there are differences, or if in fact sports is kind of spurious to all this. I don't know if it is or isn't. I'm just sensing that sometimes we assume that there are these differences between athletes and non-athletes within colleges and universities, and I don't think we should assume that anymore. And so if there may be mitigation strategies that would be effective for all students, and we don't need specialized counselors for athletes, we just need more counselors, let's say, for everyone. Or we might need to reduce the academic pressures and the academic requirements that affect all students rather than just the ones that are affecting the athletes. Other students are busy too, right? They may not be busy with sports, but they could be busy with other extracurricular activities. They might be working, they might have family responsibilities, and there's no reason to prioritize the time pressures on athletes over the time pressures on non-athletes. I'm always interested in issues with gender and why the pandemic and even pre-pandemic, that these differences in how people are internalizing stress and anxiety seem to play out along gender lines very strongly. And of course, I want to make sure that we don't just pay attention to revenue generating Division One sports, that all sports, revenue, non-revenue, and all divisions, well, not all divisions. I'm never quite sure what to do with Division Two. I think a lot of us share that, and when we study college sports, is that it's not really a hybrid so much as a residual. But Division One and Division Three, I think we're maybe a little clearer on what those are and how they, at least allegedly, are different from each other. So the beginning of the systemic analysis, right, is, again, I want to show how things outside of the individual, right, outside of their ability to cope or their ability to adapt or their ability to find ways to deal themselves with increasing stress, is what are the sources of stress and how can we understand them and how can we perhaps adjust them in ways and not take them for granted as though it has to be the way it is, right? So that academic demands and increasing academic demands at certain universities, do they have to be, right, as rigorous as they are? Why? Is that something that's beyond reflection and critical discussion? The demands of a sports team, right, and how important sports actually is, the importance of winning, the importance of being visible, the importance of things like representing your university. Does it have to be, the sports have to be as serious as it is? And then family pressures, which may not seem like they're directly linked to what goes on in higher education, but in some of the research that I've been doing, it seems that family pressure exerts its way oftentimes through sports for those people who happen to be college athletes. And of course, there are other things that we may need to take into account of personal relationships and people worried about their future. So here's sort of how it would look if I was to model the way I want to approach and how I'm going to structure the empirical work around kind of ferreting these things out. So it all comes down, and Richard South and I have had a lot of discussions about this. Well, not a lot, but we've had more than I have had with other people about the neoliberal corporatization of higher education. That's become kind of the driving force theoretically of the work that I've been doing for the past couple of years and will be doing for the next several years, I hope. Right? This emphasis on branding, this emphasis on revenue, it has these side effects, and it works through. Right? That's really the motor. That's really the engine. And things like academic intensity and media dynamics, sports intensity, are all reflecting somehow the need for higher education now in its new business model to always be visible, to always develop its brand, to try to maximize revenue streams, whatever those revenue streams. They might not be directly from sports. They could be indirectly associated with sports, with merchandising, with selling season tickets, and alumni donations. I'm of the ilk right now that a lot of the current money that's invested in intercollegiate sports at every level is done more for alums than it is for current students who, let's face it, don't really participate as spectators very much for most of the intercollegiate sports that exist on a campus. Now, there's been a little bit of research down here in the corner, not very much. These are some things which kind of inform this perspective, looking beyond the psychological, looking at the way that sports is organized and the way that higher education is organized as the source of stress, not people's inability to cope. Now, in terms of one thing in particular, a little blocking there. Hold on. So I'm adapting this from Emil Durkheim's work on suicide, right? And his emphasis that a level of integration with other people and with other groups is crucial to people, let's say, not committing suicide. Right? This was his model for why people committed suicide. But that there you can have too little integration, which is a bad thing because you're not connected to other people, and you can have too much integration, which means you lose your sense of identity, you lose your sense of self. And both of those iterations of integration are not healthy, right? Durkheim would argue, and I would contend that's true. My feeling is that college sports of all sorts, men's, women's, Division I, Division III, revenue, non-revenue, has moved continually toward being overly integrated, right? Asking people for a complete commitment. And Sarah Hatterberg wrote a brilliant essay on this a couple of years ago using Erving Goffman's motif of the total institution and arguing that college sports is becoming more and more like a total institution, demanding complete and utter obedience, large levels of surveillance over students or over athletes. It applies to students as well, but maybe more especially to athletes. Their social media accounts are watched. Every minute of the day is watched. And I can tell you that 30, 40 years ago when I was playing college sports, and when my colleague who was making the documentary with me was playing big time Division I college basketball, when the season was over, the season was over. That was it. We were done and we were on our own. If we wanted to play, we could play, but there was no oversight. There was no surveillance. There was no micromanaging of our time 12 months out of the year and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So sports has become what another person has called a greedy institution, right? It's demanding more and more allegiance, more and more time, more and more commitments. So how this affects what I'm looking at empirically is I'm putting together a survey right now to try to gauge how different elements of people's lives are the sources of stress. Right? I don't want to just understand that there's stress and how stressed they are. I want to figure out what's the most important cause of the stress. So I'm going to ask them to order things, to prioritize things, to put the sources of stress into an ordinal so that we can figure out what's really going on and what's not. And all these other things that I've been talking about, I want to get into more deeply in the survey again, so it provides a roadmap of sorts for more thorough, in-depth interviews. In terms of the social class, a lot of the research that we've done on class is a little vague. It usually operates at the level of people's hometowns, right, which we can usually discern from rosters or maybe zip codes if you're lucky. I'm going to try to get people's addresses. I'm in a battle right now with IRB about this. It's not protected by FERPA restrictions, directory information. So if you can get people's addresses and then use that to locate census tracts, you can get a much better idea of actual family income and how that's related. It's pretty clear that family income, it has a strong connection to suicide ideation and to suicide itself. Finally, we're hoping to do this documentary at some point and use it not just as an educational tool, but also as a mitigation strategy, offering it to schools and say, look, these are the sorts of things that you can do to try to lower the likelihood of stress among both athletes and non-athletes. And it's not just a question of getting them more counseling. We've got to kind of go beyond that limited thinking and introduce new ways of perhaps restructuring higher education and restructuring intercollegiate sports. So that's about it for now. I wasn't going to talk for 25 minutes, but it seems like I've talked for 25 minutes. I would welcome your comments at some point by email, and I really look forward to seeing some of you next year at CSRI or perhaps at the NAS conference if it pulls off wherever it's supposed to be. Good luck and have a good rest of the conference, such that it is. Take care, everyone. Be well.